In this lecture, I want to explore creativity in relation to Keats's Odes. And I'll start by looking at some of the fascinating extracts that we have from his letters. So I want to begin with a scene which is probably not unfamiliar to many young men. This morning, I am in a sort of temper, indolent and supremely careless. My passions are all asleep from my having slumbered till nearly 11, and weakened the animal fibre all over me to a delightful sensation about 3 degrees on the side of faintness. So what we have here is a self-image, quite a humorous self-image of Keats describing to us a scene of indolence, which might surprise us because he's also thinking of that indolence, that kind of laziness, that strange movement out of the mind and simply being a body lying there in a state of carelessness as something which is creative. So Keats is immediately inverting our expectations here, maybe challenging some of our real assumptions about the relationship between poetry and intellect. One of the really fascinating aspects of Keats, I think, is the way in which he actually might seem to be an anti-intellectual poet, the way in which he challenges notions of mind and reason. So in this state of indolence, describing himself, as I say, semi-comically, he finds a state of creativity, where creativity is linked to the relaxation of the body. There's really quite a kind of material take here on creativity, that he's describing it almost in medical terms, probably referring to some of his own medical training as a physician. The idea of the animal fibres and the nerves being in a strange state of relaxation. And then he reflects on this further, because it's also a kind of journey. It's also something that I think we've come to associate with Keats, which is a kind of shift of identity, about mobility of identity. So one of the first things he takes up in thinking about lying abed in a state of indolence is also a kind of transformation of gender. He sees this as potentially an act, if we would want to call such a passive thing an act of feminization. He writes, "If I had teeth of pearl and the breath of lilies, I should call it languor. But as I am, I must call it laziness. In this state of effeminacy, the fibres of the brain are relaxed in common with the rest of the body, and to such a happy degree that pleasure has no show of enticement, and pain no unbearable frown." So there's a kind of escape here from the burden of care and worry and anxiety, which he associates with the mind. And he moves on to bring this into a much more artistic, creative and literary connection. "Neither poetry nor ambition nor love have any alertness of countenance as they pass by me. They seem rather like 3 figures on a Greek vase, a man and 2 women, whom no one but myself could distinguish in their disguisement. This is the only happiness, and is a rare instance of advantage in the body overpowering the mind." So although he ends up admitting that this is an exception, this is a rare instance of the advantage of the body overpowering the mind, nevertheless, it's something that obviously he finds fascinating, this relationship between the body and the mind, and is finding in that strange relationship, where one of those two is suddenly relaxed, an opportunity to think creatively. That's a creative moment. So that might be some kind of comfort to us all, that lying in bed till 11 is a source of creativity. So I'd like to take that idea one step further and think about identity in Keats's Odes, how we might see an idea like that manifest in the form of these intricate and exciting and excited poems. But before I do, I'd like to take up another idea of creativity from Keats's letters, and address that in terms of the mobility that I referred to earlier as a kind of creative projection. I mean, one of the things I suppose that Keats is most famous for is his statement about the idea of the chameleon poet. The idea that poets particularly, rather than the rest of us, have this capacity to change, to be shapeshifters, to change their identity, to become other things. And the idea of the chameleon poet is one that clearly appeals to Keats. We might also see a really exciting aspect of identity, almost a dangerous aspect of identity in that idea as well. I mean, when Keats, in his letters, also refers to looking out of his window and watching sparrows pick about among the gravel, he actually writes of taking part in their existence, taking part in the existence of a sparrow pecking at the gravel. So that kind of migration, that kind of capability of becoming something other than yourself can be seen, I think, both as a liberation and a kind of threat. We could also equate it with creative projection, with a kind of emotional capacity to engage with the idea of other things, a kind of empathy. But we might also see it equally as a kind of extinction, a kind of loss of self. So I want to take that idea of the loss of self and see how Keats wants to turn that to account. I think he's kind of using this as a tool to explore the paradox of creativity, that the most creative thing is when you lose yourself, when we started with a passage where, in a sense, he's lost part of his mind, so to speak, and has become a living body. So this idea that loss might give us access to something more powerful is a paradox, I think, at the heart of some of Keats's ideas of creativity. We've got another extract here from a letter where, again, he talks about mixing his identity with those of others. He writes, "When I am in a room with people, if I ever am free from speculating on creations of my own brain, then not myself goes home to myself, but the identity of everyone in the room begins so to press upon me that I am in a very little time annihilated. Not only among men, it will be the same in a nursery of children. I know not whether I make myself wholly understood. I hope enough so to let you see that no dependence is to be placed on what I said." This is a really interesting moment in a letter to a friend, where at one level, the passage ends with an admission that a friend should not take what Keats himself is saying as truth. That's a really daring thing to do in a letter to a friend. You've got to be really trusting of a friend to say, I didn't mean what I said. So this idea of not meaning what you say, of actually being experimental, of trying things out as untruths, is not just then at the heart of Keats's idea of creativity and of poetry, but also extends itself fully into his letters. It's indeed part of his wider existence. So let's have another closer look at some of those ideas that are evident in this idea of the loss of identity in this passage. Again, we've got this kind of contest, this kind of dynamic interaction going on of the mind and the body. Begins, when I'm in a room with people, and then we've got this key qualifying phrase, if I ever am free from speculating on creations of my own brain. So in some ways, what we get a real sense of there is the burden of self-consciousness in Keats, the idea that he's too much thinking, too much of the time, so that the brain is forever working, forever busy. And so that moments of laziness or indolence, as we've seen, can be a kind of, a real blessing, a relief from that burden of self-consciousness. I mean, one of the key quotations, I think, that I would always fix on from Keats would be, from the poems, would be, where but to think is to be full of sorrow. So the idea that thinking, thought itself, is a kind of pain, a kind of a mode of sorrow. And again, even in that statement, there's a mixing of what we might like to compartmentalize, of the mind and emotions. And Keats is exploring the kind of interface, if you like, the interaction between mind and body, mind and emotions, and testing out to see if you leave one bit behind, what might we find out about ourselves. So there's a kind of, I mentioned earlier that Keats is, training as a physician, as a medical physician. There's a kind of anatomy of the relationship between the body and the mind taking place here. And I suppose the most paradoxical statement about creativity that Keats makes, which is often misunderstood, is the idea of negative capability, which is a very unfortunate phrase, I think, but it very ably clinches what I've just been trying to say about paradox. So what Keats means by negative capability is really ability, but he has to use the negative in order to get to this newfangled form of creativity that he's interested in. And what he says about negative capability, this capacity in some ways to lose oneself or to lose aspects of oneself, is a real creative fund. So negative capability, he characterizes in intellectual terms as a form of doubt or uncertainty. He sees it as characterizing someone who can remain in doubt, someone who doesn't immediately reach for certainties, reach for conclusions. I mean, one of the ways in which I think Keats is defining himself against other writers of his period, particularly writers from the previous generation like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, is, particularly with Wordsworth, this idea of negative capability, the idea that you're not reaching for a conclusion. In fact, that's one of the ways in which Keats distinguishes between Coleridge and Wordsworth and himself. This idea that you enjoy the mystery of things, you enjoy the uncertainty of things.